Welcome to the Story Copywriter Podcast, the show that teaches you everything you need to know to write stories that sell and become the written voice of a business you love. With me, your host and founder of Story Copywriters, Rob Drummond. Storytelling is the oldest way that humans pass knowledge from one generation to the next. And this has been going on for tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years in indigenous cultures. And in indigenous cultures, the elders of the culture protect the knowledge of those people. And this is something that I think potentially we've forgotten in today's world. This is the topic of my conversation today with Marti Spiegelman about consciousness and storytelling. I think this is digging at the root of why storytelling matters so much, why we feel at our core that our story matters. So I really enjoyed this conversation. I really think you'll get a lot from this conversation as well. So let's jump straight in to Marti sharing her story.
So it's a very interesting story, which I have to say still surprises me when I talk about it. But I was born into a short but illustrious lineage of brilliant scientists. Mostly my father was a very brilliant scientist, and as a graduate student, he helped to discover RNA, and his career went up from there. So I've grown up with the cutting edge research in biochemistry with Nobel laureates in the living room is how I usually describe it. And a focus on work and not, apologies to the rest of my family, not a lot of intelligence about being human or being in intimate relationship. It was like focus on work. And so I watched my dad love his work, love discovery, love imagining what could be. That's how he had the idea that his original idea was that bacteria was actually alive, and they used to think it was inorganic, right? That's how they stumbled on RNA. But his whole generation, they were visionaries. And yeah, they lived in the lab and their families never saw them. But they were visionaries, they were connected globally, they were helping one another. And so I grew up with this like highly sort of blindered view, very narrow view of what was possible. And I was both expected to be quiet and become the next Madame Curie. And so in my family, going to schools like Harvard and Caltech was like having cornflakes for breakfast. We just did it, right? Mm-hmm. So I go off to Harvard and I try to get a biochem degree. I actually did get a biochem degree. But I realized two things very quickly. One is that I was not going to be allowed to be me, because I was like the walking representative of my dad, who was very powerful, and people either loved him or truly hated him. So, and I was really naive and young, and I didn't want to carry that. So that was one thing. And the other thing is I realized I didn't like my colleagues, my peers at university, but I don't want to spend my life with these people. Mm-hmm. So this is where the magic that I can't understand started to happen. So I happened to have met someone who came from a very different background, and she was taking something called graphic design. And I thought, well, that sounds better than biochemistry. So I went to this design teacher whose name was Toshihiro Katayama. And he was such a lovely soul. And I was terrified because I was dropping my biochem major, which is heresy for me with my last name. I had to finish a degree. And so I got an ordinary biochem degree, but I had to like fill my card. So I go to Toshi and I'm just quaking in my boots. And I say, well, I really want to try design. Could I possibly take your course? And he's very Japanese, and he's sitting with his hands in prayer mode, and he's really nodding to me. And I finally realized I should stop talking. And Toshi, he said this, I'm quoting him. He said, so all you need is to want, so, quote unquote. I mean, that's an angel sent to me from heaven. All you need is to want. So I took Toshi's course and a few art history courses and a fabulous architecture history course, which was very important later on. And on the basis of that, somehow I got into Yale Design School for my graduate work, which is, I still can't explain it because I was competing against 300 people who had portfolios a foot thick and mine had like 10 pieces in it. I don't know. But I said, yes, and what are you going to do? So I became a graphic designer. And for 20 years, I had a design corporation in San Francisco, and I helped to bring the Macintosh on the market as a design tool and did the magazines for them. And I had a really great time for 20 years. And then the economy started to crash and the design business got really hard. And I still can't believe I did this either. One day I quit. It was just too impossible. There were no budgets. The clients were too stressed. The computers that we were supposed to use weren't up to the quality of design I was trained to. I thought, I can't do this. So I quit. What are you going to do? So in California, when you quit in midlife, when you have a crisis, you get energy healing. That's the California recipe. So I go off to get energy healing and I meet this guy from Scotland who's practicing and teaching visionary craniosacral work. And so I get a whole bunch of sessions from him. And one day he says, you should study with me. And I said, I'm a designer. So I hemmed and hawed and resisted until one day the school where he taught in Monterey, the Monterey Institute of Touch, my version of MIT, called me up and said I'd been signed up for a class. So I gave in and I went. And it turns out in the first hour of this class on energy healing and craniosacral work, it was apparent to my teacher, his name is Hugh Milne, that I already knew how to do the work at some level. And so I trained with him and I taught for him, and eventually I developed my own program. And I was getting all these incredible downloads about consciousness and energy. And I realized I had always been really curious about human consciousness. Because I came from a family where you were either like intensely professional or completely disconnected, and there wasn't any in between. And I was like, how do people get this way? What drives people? How do some people have drive and other people not have any? And so I'm intent on human energy and connection. And I'd already started traveling in the wilderness just because I wanted to take a vacation and I had a chance to go to Alaska. So I began my lifelong love of the Arctic and things like that. And so while I'm doing all this, I get in the mail, regular mail printed on pieces of paper, invitations to study with indigenous elders on 3 different continents. It's 3 separate invitations. I have no idea how they found me, but I didn't have that much to do, and I said yes to everything. So within a couple of years, I was at least at my first levels of initiation in 3 different traditions, and I just kept teaching. And I kept going for my own initiations, and I kept teaching, and I kept until here I am. And along the way, I have to say that a couple of things happened. One is that I began to realize that indigenous cultures, the elders in particular, were simply experts in consciousness. And the elders' job was to maintain the integrity and the evolution of the consciousness of their people. And that meant the people lived, in English we'd say, lived in harmony with the forces of nature, were in conversation. That's how they knew so much about tending agricultural fields, because they could talk to the land. And they literally found out which plants to plant. Now, our scientists trundle after them and say, oh, it's because of this biological thing and that biochemical thing. You don't need modern science to know these things, right? And the elders were the ones who kept all of that on track. They ensured that everyone thrived as best as possible, that there was continuity generation to generation. So that's the first thing. Then I started to notice that in all the different cultures, from West Africa to South America to Asia and the Himalayas, the underlying principles were exactly the same. The form, the symbols, the colors, the languages, all different, but the underlying principles are exactly the same.
An outward expression of the same
The
thing.
same principles, which I now call the technologies of consciousness. And I have to credit Malidoma Somé for being what I think the first indigenous elder to come to the West and talk about indigenous technologies, because it's technical. It's not subjective. It's not eye-based. It's not a vague idea. It's physics. It's absolute physics. And so I was realizing all this. And then I'm sitting somewhere in this arc of time, I'm sitting with my Peruvian friend in at a little outdoor cafe in the main square in Pisac in the Sacred Valley of Peru. And we're just chatting away. And I get this, it was like the voice of God and a beam of, celestial light coming down on me. And I realized, oh my God, this is what business needs. These principles of consciousness that produce presence, connectivity, the right understanding of what to invest in and how to invest for multiplicities of return, the natural creation and maintenance of community and collectives, longer arcs of continuity, thriving, everything we're looking for is actually full consciousness. And that began my entry onto the path that led me to meeting you and many people around the world. And my what I now think of as incredibly courageous, although at the time that might have been naive, a determination to bring everything that I've been given to the modern world, and especially to leaders in business and community and education and governance. The leaders need it. Yeah, we can't train everybody, we can't educate everybody on the ground, but we can change the consciousness of people who are willing to be leaders, who are willing to engage a different story, a different understanding of the universe and our place in it. This is where we're meeting today in that point. And we can change their consciousness, and the ripple effect is profound.
The ripple effect on the communities that they serve and the businesses that they build and the people that they touch.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's really profound. And I watch some of the people I've trained and how the world around them changes. And they don't have to go teach anybody. They just become, they have a different way of being, which means that they connect differently, they love differently. What they do, the actions they take are different and come from a different sense of what's valuable. All of this happens when you change consciousness.
Are there any specific signs that this might be a key problem that you need to address? Any kind of symptoms to watch out for that means that if you're in a leadership role or want to be, that this is something that you really need to pay attention to?
Yes. What an interesting way to ask the question. One of the things I see, I'll just talk from experience for a moment and see what other downloads come through. I work with a lot of business advisors and very, very smart people with beautiful visions. And they come to me over and over and over again saying, I had this great proposal. It looked like they were going to take it. Everything was all set. And then at the last minute, they said no. And then these wonderful, brilliant advisors do another proposal, and they go through whatever process they use. They use the same process. They go through the same devastatingly disappointing experience. Oh, we had them. They were going to sign up. It was going to be wonderful. And then they said no. And this is rampant in the arena of people who are advisors to business, who want to change how business is done, how they want to change the world. So that's one thing. Another thing to track for, I think, is one's own sense of the world. If we feel like we're too much of an outsider, we're the only ones who have the answer and nobody's listening to me. I have all these great, nobody's listening to me. Maybe it's not worth anything. And we sink down into that ancient tar pit that the inner critic is always tending. Yeah. The inability to hold two things in awareness is a big sign.
Oh, two things
It has
like what, for instance?
Well, if you have, say you're trying to solve a problem, and there are two valid views of the problem, but you're insisting, you can't find any cell in your body that is otherwise. You're insisting that only one of those approaches is going to be right. When it could be that you need both of them simultaneously to at least further the inquiry, if not solve the problem.
Right.
And or there's well, that's going to be another, I'll just repeat what I just said. So it's quite often that people get into an argument about this versus this versus this versus this, and they want it to be one thing and not two things. And so we lose a lot of ideas because we don't know how to combine things that are similar, and we don't know how to combine things that are complementary. And both of those are principles of consciousness. When you combine things that are complementary, you actually get a third thing that you can't see otherwise, that's even more empowered and useful. And when you combine things that are similar, they amplify the good stuff you've already done. And these are simply, it's a very simplistic way of saying these two principles of consciousness that we don't have access to if we're in that level of our own brains that's only wired to choose one thing or the other, one thing or the other, my culture or yours.
And that becomes quite confrontational almost as well.
There's a lot of confrontation. Yeah, there's a lot of confrontation. And then there's a lot of sort of false problem solving and false negotiation, because the people involved are still looking for their idea to be the one that gets settled on. Yeah. And so we lose multiple views of things. This is like Andy Warhol apparently said there are 360 different ways to view a sculpture, and every view is true. And then he apparently said, I just forgot to do that with my life. And everybody's out there battling for their view to be the one view that is true.
I've been trying to do quite a little bit of this, especially over the last few years. I've questioned quite a lot of what I thought I know. And I guess I'm trying to triangulate things from different perspectives to see, well, does it still hold true from this point A, from point A, B, and C?
Well, that's a brilliant thing to do. It really is. And there's also in the technologies of consciousness, there's the principle of relative truth, and there's the principle of absolute truth. And we, in our Western minds, we start judging those two phrases immediately. What do you mean relative? What do you mean absolute? But in terms of physics and astrophysics, which is our way of understanding consciousness, we have relative truth and we have absolute truth. Yeah, I mean, if you could identify a subatomic particle, it is what it is. It has spin left, spin right, no spin, I don't know. It just is. A negative charge is a negative charge, period. There you go. That's absolute truth. There are some things about the building blocks that are just so. And really everything else is relative. And that's good. The thing that we don't, it's another thing that we've lost, and maybe this is a symptom, is what is relative truth? Something is true relative to a context and a particular focal point in that context. And so we might think about feeding people on the planet. Everything that we do, if we do it consciously, has to be relative to the context of each region that needs more food.
So you end up with a multipolar world that is based on multiplicity.
Exactly. There is no one size fits all, as we love to say in America. And but we don't have the awareness we don't have the intelligence, we don't have the wiring we need to problem solve in that way. We're still this or that, and we're still very hierarchical. One thing has to be positioned above the other, and so on. but truthfully, a living system is multidimensional. I always like to envision a sphere, and the sphere isn't solid. It's made up of like a three-dimensional fisherman's net. So on the surface, you see all the crossing strands, but the strands go through the sphere and they interconnect all through the sphere. And so everything's connected to everything else. Yeah.
I think this is one of the things about disciplines. Like when you think about biochemistry, for instance, and physics, like we think of these things as separate, but actually when you tug away at one, it becomes apparent that you pull away at it and it's connected to everything else. Like you can't actually separate it out.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. And we just keep renaming things. I know my father's field, it was the same for him from beginning to end, but it started off as I think microbiology, and then it became biochemistry, and then there's a whole other bunch of words in between, but they would keep changing the name of the field. The work didn't change, but we just have to like name it and make it one thing. But yeah, everything is interconnected. Yeah, exactly. And so if we could experience the world in that interconnected way, which is what we're wired for, we would be problem solving differently. We would be creating more resilient, vibrant, multidimensional systems that could address any given challenge in multiple ways, depending on the context. We would regain our genius.
I do think we need to kind of redefine, I mean, looking at my field in particular, which is marketing, like I do think we need to redefine marketing with some of these principles in mind.
Definitely. Absolutely. That's been a conversation I've been having with a lot of people who work with me and come to study in my program. I am really intent on redefining marketing, because it's not about convincing somebody to choose A over B. That's that old style of limited consciousness. Yeah, it's not A over B. Really, marketing it's more like helping people understand where they belong in the membership of life, and what their function is in the big scheme of life, and what would help them thrive and really excel in that function. And it's not one thing is better than another. It's one thing that I've realized is that in a real living system, that value is determined by function, not position. And if we're trying to market, we say, my thing is more valuable than yours because it gets you to a higher position and higher this and higher that. But then, even if I'm a little more aware, I might say, well, it's not about position. It's going to help you be more skillful, but it's still focused into the ego of the person. And I think what we really need to do is to bring services and products to people that help them become part of the collective. Not drive them back into their ego where they get separated out.
And that to me feels like the highest function of marketing. That feels like something that's worth getting out of bed for and doing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, that isn't just making more noise for the sake of
it. Yeah, exactly.
And we're not saying that it shouldn't be profitable and the metric shouldn't be good or whatever, but there's a more foundational principle here.
Yeah, and actually, a functioning conscious system, whether it's a forest or a bunch of people well connected, profit is generated. There has to be profit. You have to generate extra energy and momentum so the system keeps growing and evolving, so it can feed itself and feed its parts and have more to keep growing and create new stuff. Yeah, that's what everything in nature does, except for human systems. They're supposed to be profit. In fact, one of the earliest shamanic traditions.
Profit could be time. It's not just money in the bank. It could be you having time, surely, with
all kinds of, yes, all kinds of profit. Everything that feeds our growth, everything that keeps a long arc of continuity, so we have the momentum to keep going and improving as we go. Yeah.
You used the term a few minutes ago called, you mentioned the collective. This is something that I think I relate to quite a lot. So just to give you a bit of context, like I am not, I do not have a particularly spiritual upbringing, and it's something that I'm kind of learning, that I think there is something in these things. It just isn't something that I believe in, this sort of dogma of.
Yeah.
But I do believe in the collective. I think it's telling that like the greatest improvements in human standards of living and having free time and having profit come in periods of population growth. And there could be various reasons behind that, but it feels like the more we are connected and the more there are of us, like the better we are. I think conversely, over the last 3 years, we've seen how damaging isolation is to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. And I'll add to that, my sense, my understanding of this principle of the collective, it's not just humans. It cannot possibly just be humans. I always like to quote Janine Benyus, who's the founder of the Biomimicry Institute. And she says, nothing exists outside of a system. Nothing. Right? And no system exists outside of an even larger system. That's what the elders will tell you. So even as humans, if just human to human, we start behaving better and working together more, if we don't recognize that we are part of and supported by a larger system, we're still going to fail.
This goes back to the thing of like, you try to pull away one thing and realize it is actually connected to everything else. It's the same idea, should be.
Exactly. And this actually brings us back to story and identity, because especially for humans, in order to be part of a collective, it does not mean giving up your identity. A collective does not mean hippie commune, everybody has to be the same. That fails. Imagine every cell in your body was the same kind of cell. You wouldn't exist, right? The so-called collective only thrives if every single part understands its uniqueness and its unique value and its function.
Well, your body is a system. It's a complex system, and it is a collective.
Yeah. And every part has to know that it exists, that it's valued, that it's priceless, that it has to function in its unique way, has to give that function into the system so the system can in turn support it. Now, just feel into that. I try to do this every day, actually. Feel into a world where every human is supported in that way. And this is way beyond the ego structure, because the ego is supposed to be the home of our personality, and that's it. It's not supposed to have all the other burdens we put on it. Imagine life is actually supporting you. Imagine you're actually recognized for who you are. Imagine your service in the world is automatically received and you automatically get paid for it, instead of this hideous struggle that we have because we're competing inappropriately. That's the difference between living consciously and not consciously.
Yeah, I have a sense, I think, that maybe is shared by a lot of people, that it doesn't need to be this hard for this many people.
Exactly. And the technologies of consciousness say so. It's not just an opinion.
Yeah.
This is a technical truth. Yeah.
So how do we move from where we are? So I guess before we look specifically about the work that you do with individuals, I guess, how do we collectively move from where we are at the moment to this point where individuals are valued for who they are and the role that they serve?
The how questions always rattle my cage a little bit, because I think that in one way it's a valid question, how do we do this? But my answer is always a little bit to the side of that. First thing I think is that we need to accept that it's going to take a while, because consciousness is not a weekend event. And you cannot dictate it. You cannot put it in an HR manual. You can't strategize it. It's an experience. And for modern people, it's a very fierce experience for most people. So it takes some good mentoring and some good training, and it's going to take some time. So the vision that I hold, so instead of saying, here's how we do it, the vision I hold is that we find the people who are, I can only use this word, if there's a better word, let me know, who are quote unquote awake enough, who have something in them that is saying, I know there's something different. I know there's something different. There's a different way. Where is it? I'll do anything. Yeah. Who are willing to actually find their own story. Yeah. Who are willing to go inside themselves to see, okay, this is a protection I've been wearing. This is an untrue story about myself. I'm willing to shift all this stuff. I'm willing to change how I relate to myself and to the world. And we need those people to be the visionaries, the ones who want to make a change, who are not afraid to take a leadership role, take a guiding role.
So it's not people who are necessarily in leadership roles to begin with. It's people who have a certain mindset.
Exactly. Exactly. A lot of people currently in leadership roles are too narrowly focused and too tied to their identity, and they actually can't shift. So you're exactly right. There are a lot of extraordinary people out there who aren't heading up the big banks and so on, but these extraordinary people are the ones who are going to make the change happen. So we just need a few people willing to become beacons of light, if I can use that metaphor, who are willing to literally change their consciousness, change how they use awareness, change how they know the world, allow themselves to remember how consciousness works through a human, and let consciousness do the rest of the work. That's really the beginning, and it will take a number of generations, but the ripple effect of consciousness can work literally at the speed of light. I've literally seen huge organizations shift because one person I've trained has become conscious and done their job consciously within the organization. And at least while they were in their job at that place, the place was different.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if this is happening to a degree anyway. It feels to me like there is a growing interest in spirituality as a topic, if we use that as a broad term.
Well, I'm going to be my own devil's advocate, because the Western idea of spirituality is not
maybe a bit
really right. It's not really right. And if I get all spiritual on myself, I mean, I do some technical things with the so-called spirits that would shock most people, but that's not the role that everybody should take. And if I simply love nature and I go out and I commune with my trees, that's lovely. And it does help because it will shift the person. But to simply say it, call it spirituality in the way we're using the language now, it won't go far enough. It helps a little bit. But I think people need, especially the ones who want to be the change makers, they need more information. They need to know what that spiritual thing actually is.
Mm-hmm.
They need I often say to people, you need to know the physics of what you're engaging, because otherwise it remains at the personal level of consciousness and the ripple effect isn't so big.
So for the people that you work with directly, what does this process look like? How long does it take? And what's the starting points and what's the end points? What do those points look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's open-ended, number one, because consciousness is open-ended, right? So I don't put it out as a linear map. The way I work is I form small groups, 6 to 8 people in a group. And this is after a lot of conversation, sharing ideas, investigating how willing a person is to actually dive in and meet themselves and allow their consciousness to change and open. And so the small group starts, the first year of the training is dedicated to this business of shifting how they use awareness. And we call them exercises in English, but they're explorations, they're teaching moments. And I use the practices that have been used in indigenous cultures for tens of thousands of years. There's no better way. And so at first it looks a little odd, because, I've come here to change the world and Marty's sending me out to sit with a tree. What is this? Is this just a luxury? So, consciousness is not a luxury. So what we're doing is, in this first year of training, if you can imagine, you're on a path that has two tracks, like an old dirt road, and the grass is growing in the middle, and there's these two dirt tracks. We're traveling both tracks simultaneously. On the left-hand track, we're playing with awareness. We're learning how to notice the world, how to experience it, feel it, see it, smell it, taste it, know it. And the other track is the life we're living. And every step we take on the left-hand track, we have to realize that our experience on the right-hand track, everyday life, is changing. And these two tracks of experience move together. They never intersect. We're changing awareness, so everything else changes. So right there, we're processing information differently. We're leaving causality and jumping directly into experience that does not want to be explained or defined. It's pure experience. So this first year of training is learning a lot about awareness, a lot about our neurophysiology, how the brain processes information, how the energy body actually works, things like that. A little bit about indigenous principles. But the big thing is, are you willing to go far enough to change how you use awareness and kind of enjoy it? So given success in the first year, the next 2 years are initiation into the Andean lineages. And these are all lineages that I carry, and I'm initiated directly with the indigenous elders, and I'm being asked to bring Western people into these lineages. So I'm not copying anything. It's one of the first questions people ask me, are you just taking this? I said, no, this is my task, my responsibility in life. I've been gifted, and I'm being asked to pass this gift on and be sure that the people that I work with are using what they're given in the world, in their lives and their work.
And it's something that you've, it's not something that you've invented, it's something that you've learned as an established first principle.
I have not invented it. That is true. Yeah. And all of these principles, what I gift in the training program, first and foremost, is the specific Andean traditions, because they hold these principles of consciousness in a very pure form. They don't have a lot of weird deities with 20 arms and stuff like that you find in the Himalayas. And their cosmology, the way they understand this world and how it operates, it's physics. It's really elegant and proper and exactly what the modern world needs. It's just straightforward. And so people who work with me will carry the Andean lineages first, and then if they stay long enough, I'll transmit the other lineages that I carry. But these second and third years of training are for the transmission of the Andean lineages to the people in the training group. And that means that you actually end up with an indigenous toolkit, and we learn how to use that in the modern world. You end up with an energy body. If you have an awareness that you've got an energy body, it has extra information put into it. And so your consciousness is really quite amplified in those 2 years. And I should say, none of this involves taking plants. I don't believe in that at all. In indigenous cultures, in order to work with plant medicine, you have to be initiated first. Western people are using it as a substitute for all the work they have to do anyway. But that's another story. We could have another whole conversation about that. Anyway, so that's 3 years of training. The fourth year, and I ask every group to go at least 4 years. The fourth year is advanced application of the technologies of consciousness. And from day one, you have to live the training. It's not like yoga training where you're going to set aside an hour a day or 2 hours a day and you have to seal the world off. This kind of training that I offer, if you don't live it, from brushing your teeth to buying your oranges to working with your work teams, if you don't live it, it doesn't work. So it doesn't require extra time. It requires engaging differently. And most groups who make it through 4 years just keep going because it is open-ended. And so I have for 5 years of training for each individual group stays together themselves in 5 years of training. And then beyond that, there's a sort of graduate level where the groups start to combine and we do even more advanced work. But as long as people want to work with me, if they get through that initiation, then I'm here for it. And there's small group work and individual mentoring in between those sessions. It's wizard school.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Yeah.
Are technologies like cell phones, are they interfering with our ability to learn this and to master this?
Yeah. Our physical technologies, I could go on and on. One of the things about our physical technologies is they are withdrawing our awareness from the world. I don't know how many people I know who say that since they use GPS in the car, they couldn't find their way without it. Because we're just paying attention to a flat screen and not in connection with the world. The use of just our thumbs is going to have a terrible negative effect on the development of the motor cortex, which has an effect on how we connect energetically and physically into the world and to one another. Even just using keyboards, fingers in two planes instead of doing things dimensionally with our hands. You know, if kids are not playing with clay and building things and engaging 3 dimensions, they aren't going to know 3 dimensions. And getting your awareness into a 3rd dimension is going to be even harder. And that's one of the biggest limits to consciousness, is being aware in limited dimensions of reality. So I don't, as much as I'm like I work on my computer since the pandemic, everything's on Zoom.
Yeah.
But
well, yeah, I mean, there's plus sides because we wouldn't be able to have this conversation now. So.
Exactly. It's quite a silver lining to the storm cloud. But the other thing that I say to everyone who works with me, and I would invite everybody into this, is that a very wonderful thing about Zoom is it's a great training device for learning to extend your energy and your heart and your love right through space and time, to really connect energetically to the point where you don't remember that you're on Zoom anymore.
Yeah.
So it has that little benefit. Yeah.
I was thinking, like, I obviously try to, I was just thinking to, like, so I have some small kids, and it's really hard to sort of be conscious and be present when you've watched 15 episodes of Bluey in a go. But, you know, when we're doing crafts, and like, I try not to turn the Wi-Fi on first thing in the morning. I try not to turn the telly on first thing in the morning. We try to read books and do some other stuff. So.
Yeah. It's hard, but I always think that kids, they keep us conscious. You know, if you watch how your kids engage the world, if we did a little bit of that every day, we'd be a lot better off. A little more curiosity, a little more stepping into the unknown, a little more, oh, what's that? You know, and I always think of this metaphor that, you know, the way we learn how to walk in the first place is to get feedback from the floor. Yeah. And the way we learn how to, when we're little infants, lift our first cup of milk and get it to our mouths, we track what works and we throw away what doesn't work. So the first lifting of the cup and it goes over the shoulder, like, oh, that didn't work. We don't repeat that very often. We keep trying for what works and what we know is the most nurturant. And if we maintain that into adulthood, we'd be much better off.
Where I'm sitting right now is where my daughter has her Weetabix in the morning, and I realized just before this call that there's like dried Weetabix on the chair. It's like, well, maybe that's that principle in action.
I think it's principle in action. Yeah.
I had one final question just before we wrap up. So the 3 invites that you got from 3 separate elders pretty much at the same time.
Yeah.
Do you think that you kind of made yourself available to that, or like how, or was it a pure coincidence, or like how do you think there's something in the fact that there's maybe a message in that they all came at the same time?
Oh yeah, I think if I put on a Western lens, I would say, oh, it's coincidence. If I put on an ego-based
It's a
lens, I would
remarkable
say,
coincidence if it is, though. I mean,
yeah, right. It's like too much,
yeah.
and if I'm too self-referential, too much in my own ego, I might say I magnetized it. But the only way I can make sense of any of my story is that there are larger forces that create this world. And those larger forces are on the move. We are not in control. But sometimes those larger forces know some of us and they just drag us from here to there, to here to there, to here to there. Yeah. I can't imagine better Western educational training for what I do now. The fact that I'm comfortable with science and I know some is critical in helping people understand indigenous wisdom, because that's the kind of science. The fact that I was a graphic designer, that's the process of making the invisible visible. That's what design is, making invisible information visible and something you can use. Consciousness does that. Right? All the training I had in architecture history was a whole training in how humans relate to the planet and to space and to light and to earth, and the bringing together of heaven and earth. That's how it's said in many cultures. The bringing together of heaven and earth, especially under the stewardship of humans, is what creates this world. And I couldn't have planned that, right? Something was like taking me from here to there to here to there. Who in the world planted Toshihiro Katayama in front of me, nodding and saying us? And
that was another message, wasn't it? Surely.
Oh, complete. And so my experience, and this is also tied to the great privilege of having had some extraordinary experiences with the elders in their cultures. My experience is that there are larger forces who pick some humans, not because we're better, but I don't know what the selection process is, but they reach us somehow, they ping us and take us from here to there because they need us to be a certain kind of conduit.
It's really funny. So I'm working with Evelyn Clark at the moment on her program, but she basically got in touch and said, you know what, I've been pinged. I've had this message. You and this other fellow are supposed to be on this program. And I went, yeah, that sounds about right. I'm happy to buy into that.
Yeah. And I fully believe this is how it works, that we get pinged. If a human is too closed off for whatever reason, then the pinging doesn't register. Yeah. And I also think it's a bit of a challenge now for whatever we're going to call the spirit realm, because there have never been this many humans on the planet. Yeah. And so we make a kind of noise. There's a Mayan elder who says that the human mind makes a grinding noise when it's thinking. and that kind of backs up all the energies in the so-called spirit realm. But I think the density of humans on the planet now is kind of interfering with the pinging. But that's just the way it is, that we don't need to judge it or measure it or wail about it. Our job is to be, it's a metaphor that came to me a year or two ago. I've got this wild meadow on my property, and every year it gets green when it rains, and then it dies off and gets brown and falls to the ground. And the next year, the first rains come, and the green grass just comes up again. It doesn't stop to fix the old dead grass. It just comes up again. Right? And our job now in this time, all that disorganization and weirdness in the world, that's the grass in the meadow dying off. Our job is just to rise up again.
This has been great, Marti. How can people connect? How can people find out more about your work?
Best way is to email me directly if you're interested, Marti Spiegelman at mac.com. And also on...
That's Marti with an I, isn't it? M-A-R-T-I.
Yes, yeah. And also I have some online courses that are on gumroad.com, so you can find me there. The Introduction to Precision Consciousness is one of those online courses. And it's a wonderful introduction. It's me being interviewed, and I give some really simple exercises. But I find that people love the discussion. It's a little bit like what we're talking about today. And I go more into the specific principles of consciousness. But that's a great introduction to get a feel for what this material is all about, and how people can just do a toe dip, see what happens, relating
perfect.
just a little bit differently to the world. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'll make sure that we link to those when this episode is posted.
Yeah, great.
Great.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Such a pleasure, Rob. I hope we get to do it again. I really appreciate it.
This has been a really profound conversation, so thank you. If you've enjoyed this episode of the Story Copywriter podcast, you'll want to make sure you're on my email list. When you sign up at storycopywriters.com/podcast, I'll also send you my 7-day storytelling crash course free by email. Please also make sure you've got a copy of my simple story selling book, which is available from Amazon in paperback and Kindle formats. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.